David gave a guest lecture in my class on computational ethics at CMU a month and a half, 2 months ago, something like that. And after seeing that lecture, I was really excited, and I was like, you know what, AI 2 deserves to see the exciting things David has to say, and the discussion deserves to happen within AI 2 as well. He is a final year PhD student at CMU in the Department for Societal Software Systems and something computing. It's called S3D. I forget what exactly it stands for. And he's going to be joining. Sorry, where are you going after this again? Is it NYU?
I will be at Cornell Tech in
Cornell Tech. Okay, so in New York. Yeah, he's joining Cornell Tech as a postdoc. I think in the fall, right? Yeah. So yeah, he's going to talk to us about sort of the ethical dilemmas that we may face when we are developing open source technology. So take it away, David.
Thanks for the excellent introduction, Martin. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I want to also say, like, I've studied open source as sort of a phenomena for most of my PhD. And recently I've been, in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been thinking about AI ethics. So it's really from that confluence that this talk comes from. I really think openness in AI production needs more attention, more scrutiny, and as a distinct consideration as we think about AI ethics. And it's from that point that this talk comes from. I also will say, like, I'm presenting work I've presented before, but this is a radically different talk than I've given before. It's really using that work to sort of scaffold a discussion around openness, and I'll be integrating some other people's excellent work that I found. So I'd love critique, I'd love feedback, and I hope this just prompts a discussion we could have afterwards rather than sort of any of this being set in stone. So yeah, Martin introduced me. I'm also a painter, and I'm joining Cornell Tech soon. I'd love to talk about any of that. I'm looking for collaborations come the fall, so let me know. But what are we going to be talking about today? So this is sort of the structure of my talk. Really, releasing AI openly can enable good. It can also enable harm. And what do we do about that? I'm trying to think through that using 2 pieces of work that I've done. One about studying a deepfake community, an open source deepfake community who creates deepfake tools for anyone to use and anyone to create deepfakes with, and releases that as open source software. I'm sure we can imagine there might be some concerns about what that might be used for, and we're looking at how that community reconciles those concerns. Then we sort of generalize that. We're looking at the AI supply chain and how different pieces of code and different pieces, different data sets and different modules are assembled to create AI systems, and how that complicates accountability and ethics more generally. And then I'm going to present some thinking I've been doing, but heavily drawing on Suleiman 23, which Nicole sent me, and thinking about upsides and downsides of openness very briefly, before then talking about middle ground approaches to openness and advocating for what I call Swiss cheese thinking. That'll be the structure of my talk. I'm going to jump straight into thinking about deepfakes. This is work that I published at FACT and presented at FACT in Korea last year. We wanted to study open source. That was sort of where we started, and we wanted to pick a project that had sort of known ethical dilemmas, right? But I think it's first important to take a step back and realize that open can mean a lot of different things. I mean, in the AI space, it can mean open data sets, open models, fully open code. I mean, there's a lot of gradations on what open means, but even the word open source, or the notion of open source, has a very complex history. Gabriella Coleman is an anthropologist who sort of researched and studied ethnographically that history, and wrote about how free software had an explicitly sort of political anti-corporate history, and then open source software was sort of getting rid of that sort of connotation and making the case for it on business case grounds. So sort of a corporate rebranding of free software, and sort of how those political commitments have changed. I'm sure we're quite familiar, but in open source communities, often volunteers build software and make it freely available for anyone to use for anything. Those are called non-discriminations to persons or field of endeavor by the Open Source Initiative, the governing body, and nor really inability to know when it's used. Like, you might not know what someone's using it for. We've probably heard of deepfakes. They spoof someone's face on another person's body, often, sometimes for satirical or artistic purposes. But I was surprised to learn that actually the vast majority of deepfakes found online are non-consensual porn depicting women. And a lot of scholars have studied the harms that come from those, from that non-consensual depiction in pornography. So there's real harm that are caused to real people here. And, you know, I thought of it as like deepfake Tom Cruise or deepfake Obama, and that's importantly not the dominant use case. So we interviewed 11 developers of an open source deepfake creation tool about their sense of agency and responsibility. So agency, the feeling that they were able to control the ethical impact of what they create, and responsibility, the feeling that they ought to, that it's their job to do that, to address downstream harm. So what did we find? First of all, this is our sort of headline finding, is open source licenses are a legal artifact, but they also enforce strong norms against restricting downstream use, which limited participants' feelings of agency to control downstream harmful use. So this is a legal artifact. It's a, you know, written to be enforceable, but it also enforces this way of thinking of like, this isn't my problem. This isn't my job to think about. Someone saying I cannot stop people from using my software for stuff I don't agree with. Open source is net positive, is also its negative. It's, you know, double-sided coin. But also participants recognize the flip side. If we had more centralized control, that would help prevent misuse. They were referencing other deepfake apps that could implement filters because they were implemented as a software as a service, for example, or sort of a online like app. So freedom zero, which is sort of the freedom that is coming from the free software movement as this basic freedom to use it for whatever you want, for anyone to use it for whatever they want, maximizes agency for software users, but it minimizes developers' agency to decide what their systems should be used for. So it's giving as much freedom as possible to the user and less freedom to the developer to make these kind of judgment calls. And wider open source norms acted as a frame in our participants' mind for understanding their own ethical responsibility. However, some of our participants also set and enforced counter norms, or at least attempted to, going against sort of this overriding open source norm that, you know, this is not our problem to think about. After choosing an open source license, you know, participants didn't feel they had that many other opportunities for agency, to exert agency over what their stuff was used for. But they did attempt to set counter norms against harmful uses. For example, they had public statements where the code is downloaded, and in sort of their Discord where they coordinate development work, saying, you know, this is not for changing faces without consent. You shouldn't use it this way, and we'll ban you if we discover that you're using it this way. So they attempted to set those counter norms, but of course, you know, and they enforced them. They banned people who admitted to using it for porn, for example, but they admitted that like not everyone's going to tell them that. So they realized that this is not a 100% solution. And why did they do this? Some of this was motivated by their own personal sense of ethics, but that was sort of an intrinsic motivation. But extrinsically, they had also been threatened with deplatforming on GitHub. They had been threatened with deplatforming from Discord, and also they had at one point been delisted in Google search. You know, so this highlights the power of platforms and the power of like where things appear and where they don't as a forcing function to get people to accept and think harder about how people use their software. So again, centralizing power here. Community leaders have some power over members and sort of setting norms and banning people who seem to be using it for harm or what they perceive as harm. And platforms also have power over community leaders. We also heard strong discourses of technological inevitability. Some of you may have heard of this idea, but in this case, it was something like participants viewed their role in developing deepfake software as sort of insignificant in the context of available alternatives. One person said, you know, this sort of thing was going to happen. Deepfake porn was going to happen whether or not I participated in the project. Some others viewed other competitor deepfake tools as in a race, like, sort of like, we want to build this, we want to make it better. You know, this other project is you know, steaming along, they're gonna, you know, make more realistic deepfakes than we can. Seeing them as a competitor, sort of, this is going to happen. This is, you know, this is already locked into a race. Now I'm breaking out of the deepfake case a little bit here, but you know, we've heard OpenAI talk about the competitive landscape, and that's why they chose to not release some of GPT-4 publicly. And I sort of reject that notion. I mean, if you're talking about purely economic incentives, fair, but that's not an ethical argument. It's not a race to build the new thing. It's a race to do something good with it. So that's where I come down on this sort of race mindset. People were saying if you ban something, it just goes underground. The genie's out the bottle. And then this is a really evocative quote. Nothing can stop the steam engine that is progress. And technology, it's only getting better, faster. Sort of like this feeling that we are powerless over the technology that we are actually developing ourselves. So they sort of use this discourse to claim that laws against deepfake videos or restriction of deepfake tools were sort of resisting the inevitable, ineffectual, not likely to have any effect. And here I bring in some philosophy from Chandler here, who writes that accepting the technological imperative sort of implies a suspension of ethical judgment or social control. We're sort of then serving the technological system and sort of disavowing our own agency in its creation. Related to this is the notion of technological neutrality. The idea that, we're building a neutral deepfake tool, but people can use it for whatever they want, and the ethics is up to them. So people saying things like, you can't blame the project. It's like blaming the people that make the paint and the canvas, and then someone else uses it to do something, paint something offensive. And this reveals an instrumentalist view, tools seen as value neutral. Now here, there's a really interesting piece by Evan Selinger, who argues like you can toss a gun around like a frisbee, and you can probably kill someone with a frisbee if you tried really hard, but that's not what the tools are designed to do, and they actually make those uses really difficult, and they make the opposite really easy. So we actually do make choices in how we design things that, and those are called affordances. We choose to build things to make certain things easier or certain things harder, and this affects how it will likely be used. And this little cheese icon is what I'm going to build to in the Swiss cheese model at the end. It's like the layers we can build in that might not stop all misuse, but might stop some. And in this case, one person recognized this explicitly, like, maybe if we added a filter for deepfake porn, someone could easily take it out. It's open source. But if we make it harder, maybe people without technological skill won't know how to remove that filter, and then it will at least stop some misuse, for example. So that's a very brief presentation of my FACT 2022 paper. I'll briefly pause for any clarification questions. And if there are none, then I'll just go on to sort of generalizing this and thinking about the AI supply chain more broadly. Any brief questions here? Cool. For those of you who are keeping video on, that's nice to have faces to look at. I appreciate it. So in the second case, who's seen this sort of map before? This is the Anatomy of AI. It's by Kate Crawford and Vlon Yoler. This is a account of all of the different labor and materials that go and like data and components and software components and hardware components that go into making an Amazon Echo Dot work. It's an art piece that's installed on the wall of a few different art museums in the world. And I think this is a really good way of thinking about how like the small pieces that we work on fit into a much broader context that enable something, an ordinary object that we take somewhat for granted, or at least I do. And this sort of brings the point, like, everything is modularized. Everything is sort of, there's components that can be used for many different things, and that makes it really hard to think about accountability and ethics. And with that point, this is where the next piece of work I'm going to present is a work I did with Dawn Nafis. She's an anthropologist working at Intel Labs on my thesis committee, excellent mentor to me. And so we examined how people at different points in what we call the AI. Can people see my cursor, by the way? Yeah, okay, cool. So different points in the supply chain, think about their ethical responsibility and accountability. So some people were building a data set, some people were making a model, some people were using that model to do something with. So we sort of looked at how feelings of accountability and responsibility changed as you go from more basic or fundamental capabilities to more specific tailored end use cases. And we found that the idea of software modularity, which, as a software engineering scholar, we kind of assume and take for granted reasonably, I mean, it's how you build large systems, is not only a technical practice, but a social practice that can make it easier to disavow harm. I'm sure we know what software modularity is, but it sort of underlies the idea of a general purpose object. This is, not my problem because it's general purpose for anything it can enable any kind of use. But modularity has ethical implications. It allows a disavowal of concerns outside the module and allows division of labor, which is also useful for efficiency and all that as well. By the way, the paper's here if anyone's interested. So we found that AI developers rely on upstream data sets and fundamental models, looking up the supply chain, but they often disavow, I just found this online, it's not up to me to check it for bias. or I just found this model, I'm just using it in here. I assume the model works, and it's not my problem if it has some flaw in it. But then even looking downstream, you can think back to the deepfake case. People release what they build openly for anyone to use for anything downstream, looking down the supply chain, and they disavow these uses. So this is showing how sort of this supply chain nature of AI, when we think of it this way, sort of how that might enable disavowal of accountability, but also how that might actually let us think about where the stuff I build, where the stuff we build are positioned in relation to the things we depend on and the things that what we are building gets used for. And thinking a little bit back to the deepfake case, this is something we made in that paper. We draw a distinction between what we call implementation-based harms, which we say are harms that are inherent in how a system is built. For example, bias or self-driving cars not recognizing pedestrians in wheelchairs. And this can be fixed with better data sets or fixes to make things fair, accountable, or transparent. But in contrast, at least in a lot of the fact literature that I've read, that it can often lead to ignoring some use-based harms, which are harms inherent in how a system is used. We might have been familiar with Google's Project Maven protests. No one was protesting unfair drone striking. They were protesting drone striking. And in the deepfake case, it doesn't make sense to think about building better deepfakes or more fair deepfakes. It's not about that. It's about misuse. So we're trying to draw this distinction to make it really clear about how we can expand the kind of ethical concerns we think about. And oftentimes use is tied to business cases, which can be maybe at least in for-profit companies, why it's sometimes harder to talk and think about use-based misuses. Yep, like I said, and then like I mentioned, affordances affect use. So we can design or implement things differently in a way that will then affect how they're used. And we'll talk about that a little bit shortly. To bring this back to sort of the accountability question, for implementation harms, open source can be really good. You can scrutinize it. You can inspect each line of code, each data point. Transparency helps with the scrutiny. If you're looking inside your module, this is what that diagram is supposed to convey here. And this can be good, especially because a lot of systems majorly affect life outcomes. This allows accountability. But for use harms, when you're thinking outside the module, open source can actually be problematic. It is what allows broader misuse. So it depends if we're talking about a use-based or an implementation-based harm, how we evaluate whether open source is helpful. And I'll drill down into upsides and downsides of openness later in the talk. Yep, like I mentioned here. So a little bit about our empirical results. We saw this more general purpose diagram here. Now, what did we actually find when we talked to people at different stages? So on this slide, sorry, flipping about here. On this slide, we talked to a person who is an academic making a technique to regularize model accuracy. We also talked to someone who was building more benchmarks, kind of trying to show off some functionality that their company had designed, demos, that kind of thing. And then we talked to someone making a specific piece of software for a particular end user, in this case, making virtual reality training software for the Department of Defense. So we can see how sort of some on the top are more basic capabilities and on the bottom are a little bit more specific users or use cases. And at the top, people are sort of saying this is general purpose. I'm not really concerned about how this might be used, except the general ways in which you can abuse machine learning. So it's sort of, it's not particular to me. It's a general thing, and it's, therefore not. They're kind of saying it's therefore not my job to think about too much. The application domain can be potentially endless, and it's up to the application domain about about the actual ethics of what we're doing. Here in the middle, people were kind of going, yeah, there's bias. I'm making a translation, a machine translation, natural language translation app. But yeah, I know there's gender bias, but this is just a demo. People are evaluating it for performance, not for bias, And anyway, if someone uses it downstream to actually make something real, they're an expert and they know to look for bias. So it's not on me to look for it or attempt to ameliorate it. And at the end, people are going, oh my goodness, this is the end of the line. If anything goes bad, it looks really bad on us. There could be flaws, in the upstream components we depend on. And I will be accountable for all of this upstream labor that didn't get done sort of higher in the chain. That would have made it easier for me to think about the ethics of what I'm creating now. And they also recognize they have some control over who they sell it to because they're accepting specific users or specific clients. At the same time, this person was sort of higher up in the company saying, that he was a CTO. It's my job to think about the tech. We have project managers to think about the buffer between us and users. So there is still some dislocation in between, this end of the chain here and the actual user. At least there's trying to be some. I'm not going to get too much into this, but we're drawing upon the work of an anthropologist and science and technology scholar named Lucy Suchman. Really like her work, highly recommend it. And she wrote this really cool paper called Located Accountabilities in Technology Production, arguing that developing tech must be a boundary crossing activity. Like, you can't just be thinking about like what I'm building. You must be thinking about like what I'm relying on and who's building it and who's relying on what I'm building and what they're using it for. And sort of moving away from the modularity aspect, design of discrete devices, to thinking about systems development as an entry into the network of working relations. So not even like technology as sort of an interconnected network, but actually who's building it, like the working relations of the people building it. I thought this was a really interesting point. And what we found in our study was that like what held ethics together was things that were kind of outside the supply chain. It was like company reputation concerns, or the idea that this would actually help deliver value to the consumer and seeing their users as people. So we've seen how the idea of a supply chain can lead to disavowal, but I think it can also, and this is what we sort of outlined in the last bit of the paper, about when you see it in the network view, you see it where what we're building in context of what we're using and who's using what we're building. That actually lets you see where action might take place. That actually lets you consider the particular relationships that exist there, and think about at those places as an opportunity for persuasion or for setting norms and setting a acceptable use and maybe legal remedies and things like that. So the AI supply chain allows us to view relatively general purpose AI libraries or frameworks in the context of the downstream harms they either constrain or potentiate. It's messy, and actually I'm going to flip slides because we make this point much better. I wrote a position paper based on this work with Richmond Wong, just a 2-pager, and we think about the supply chain, we think about ethics and policy opportunities. And Nike used to say, we're not responsible. I did my undergrad in Oregon, so Nike is a salient case study for me. But Nike used to disavow the working conditions in its suppliers' factories, but then they eventually realized that no, they have to be accountable for this, even just through public pressure. So they actually started, trying to ensure that the stuff they depended on didn't rely on slave labor or child labor. But unfortunately, we see this repeated today when OpenAI responded to criticism of underpaying its data labelers by saying, oh, it was a subcontractor. They're in charge of benefits and pay. So I think we ought to think up the supply chain and down the supply chain when we think about ethics here. And this offers some opportunities up the supply chain. So we talked about deepfakes. We talked about generalizing this case study a little bit to think about the AI supply chain more generally. I'm going to pause for any brief, clarification questions or anything else. Anyone have any? Cool. Go ahead, Jen.
Sure. I think it's a loaded question since I'm a non-researcher, but I find it really interesting that you are bringing in perspectives from outside just pure research. And like, if you could talk on your thoughts about what the right sort of mix of technical, non-technical, and what a good group of stakeholders might be to have these conversations. Absolutely.
So thanks for the question. I actually just got back from travel where I presented at an anthropology conference some of this work. And I found some of my most I have a background in computer science. I'm at the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. But I've actually found that some of the most useful ways of thinking about ethics are at that border between a technical practice and social sciences and the anthropology. I think, the anthropological view never tries to sort of like scorn or shame people for believing what they believe, right? Like, this is about understanding why people act the way they do, and then trying to put it in a broader context of, the systemic forces that, that affect technical practice. So at that sort of intersection is where I found these really awesome collaborations. And that's been a learning process for me. But it's something I'm very excited about. I also think that when you listen to people explain why they do what they like, it makes a lot of sense, So it's like good to actually. That's why I love empirical sort of qualitative research, is you actually get to understand the working relationships and the worldviews of people who are doing this kind of thing, and then understand from that sort of first-person perspective why, and then systematize that understanding, and then present possible alternatives. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any other brief ones before I push on? Cool. So those are the two pieces of work of mine that I wanted to present. And I was actually starting a paper on the upsides and downsides of openness, the sort of ethical upsides and downsides of openness, before I then stumbled upon, in fact, it was Nicole who sent it to me, Suchman, actually it was just her alone, recently published paper in February. Has anyone ever come across this work? In fact, it's right here. I really appreciated this paper, and I highly recommend it to anyone here. But I'm drawing on this paper in the next few slides I'll present. I'm reorganizing and adding my own thoughts. But yeah, so now we're going to talk about upsides and downsides, or ethical upsides and downsides of openness very briefly. So I like to situate this within OpenAI's U-turn on openness. I wonder if folks have heard of this. I bet people here have. In 2015, OpenAI wrote a blog post about, we build value for everyone, not just shareholders. We'll strongly encourage researchers to publish their work as papers, blog posts, or code, right? So, and then we have the CEO, saying we were wrong. Open sourcing AI is just not wise. And this was in the context of his belief that artificial general intelligence is possible and coming. And then in the technical report, for GPT-4, they cited a competitive landscape and safety implications as reasons why they're just abandoning the open part of their name, as I see it at least. So what happened? Why? What are the concerns here? And I hope some of these next two slides can help sort of dig into this a little bit. So in my view, and based on reading Suchman, here are some downsides of AI openness. The big one, harkening back to the deepfake study, misuse. People can misuse the system in a way that can cause harm. Deepfake porn, spam, fake news. But there's a few others. Some people think that developing AI or enabling AI development itself can be harmful. It might lead to automated jobs, increase economic inequality. So openness can actually lead to AI being developed faster, and in some perspectives that can itself be a harm. But there's also two that I really don't take that seriously. Some people believe that artificial general intelligence is possible and undesirable. I personally don't see it as a very likely possibility. So they believe that openness is a bad thing on that account, on the fact that it will mean artificial general intelligence is developed faster and earlier and will harm people. And I also just want to, have in your mind for the end of the talk, what else am I missing here? Because these are the two that I can think of, and I think really misuse is the big one here. But I probably forgot something, so please let me know at the end. Now, ethical upsides. This is a little more rich. The first one is openness may democratize access to powerful AI. Concentration of power. Right now, having powerful AI, makes powerful companies, has economic advantages, means that benefits from AI will accrue to the people who own that, right? Who own that IP or who own those models. So openness may help reduce concentration of power that AI can otherwise help concentrate, for lack of a better word. But the caveat that many people have smartly pointed out is just because you have access to code doesn't mean you have the compute or the power or the skills to do something meaningful with it. So, just because the code is open doesn't mean that actually leads to the benefits of democratization. And in particular, because you actually have to have some political power. And I don't mean political Republican Democrat, I mean sort of the ability to affect the world, to use AI then to make some meaningful change in the world. Another openness, and this is one I take really seriously, is that openness is important for replicability and for the scientific method. This is a really important way we establish about, as scientists, as researchers, we establish what is true in the world. So I think openness is crucial for enabling us to agree on what works and what doesn't, what is good, what is good and what is bad, and what is true and what isn't. And I think an important implication of this, and this is my own opinion, that non-open AI work should not be accepted into scientific literatures. That's my own view. So I'm worried that people are, OpenAI may try to publish, or they certainly will try and publish papers based on proprietary models that can't be replicated, can't stand up to the normal scrutiny of the scientific process, and that concerns me. I also think openness allows more perspectives. I have 2 perspectives, but that's good because more perspectives in the room to scrutinize the system for harm. And especially from folks who might not be highly represented among AI developers. So this is a benefit of open source, and this has actually been studied before, but like the benefit of open source is anyone can see how it works and anyone can scrutinize it, and that allows wider scrutiny and wider sort of investigation of possible, implementation harms, bias, or, harmful decisions made, or something like that. This is what I consider a very bad argument for AI openness. This might be this is not an ethical, concerns about competitive landscape is not an ethical argument in my view. It's an economic argument or an economic disincentive. So I look really poorly on nonprofits like OpenAI, which make this argument as a reason for not releasing their code. And I think it's dubious at this point to call them a nonprofit. I mean, I'm sure we have seen their weird little structure with like a for-profit company owning a nonprofit. I don't get it. But I don't take this seriously as an ethical upside of openness. Or yeah. I also don't take nation state concerns seriously. I think there's a lot of concerning discourse about like, what about China? Because I think that nationalism can be used to justify other unethical behavior. I grew up overseas, and I think countries use technology differently for a variety of good and problematic things. But I don't think that like trying to win against some other country is going to actually lead us in a good ethical direction overall. Of course, these are my opinions, and I would love to hear anything else you think goes here, and anything else I might have forgotten or you might disagree with. So we've talked about deepfakes, we've talked about the AI supply chain, and more generally, and I very briefly summarized some of the main upsides and downsides of openness, drawing on Suleiman 23. Now I'm going to advocate for middle ground approaches to openness and for what I call Swiss cheese thinking. What is this cheese icon that's appeared throughout this talk? So here is an overview, and I'll drill into these, but there's ways we can use licensing for ethics. There's ways that we can set norms and encourage community governance. There might be ways that we can do enforce or enact technological restrictions or usage monitoring. There might be ways of doing release gating or staged and partial releases. And I'll talk through some of what I see as the main pros and cons of a lot of these different things, or different ways of doing them even. But I also would love to hear at the end of the talk what else you think might go here. So the first one, and this is the one that I'm most knowledgeable about because of studying open source for so long, is that increasingly software licenses have been seen as a tool for ethics. Hugging Face recently released the Open Rail license, a way of attempting to use licenses to allow certain use cases or disallow others. I've actually talked with Carlos, and I think he has some really good thinking on that, in part because he cited my paper in his blog post. But he's sort of using he's a lawyer thinking through the thorny enforcement issues here too. There's also the Organization for Ethical Source, which is a more grassroots activist organization trying to rethink open source licensing as a tool for ethical purposes. And there's also people proposed behavioral use licensing, such as Contractor et al. at FACT 2022, and I really enjoyed that paper. So a common objection is enforcement is hard, and I agree. Misuse isn't, but the rebuttal that I think is quite compelling is that misuse isn't just done by individuals who may very well ignore legal licenses and use it in secret. Misuse can also be done by companies who have lawyers who will enforce the terms of that license on their people to avoid them being sued. I think when we think about misuse, I think it's common to think about, someone in their basement who is doing something secret, and that is a common case. But I think it's also, if we're thinking about the downstream ethical impact of what we want to create and how we want it to be used, we can also think about other institutions which might use what we're building, which are more sensitive and more susceptible to legal means, like companies. Also, licenses help set norms, which are themselves powerful, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Another objection is that ethical licenses may dissuade adoption. For example, some companies won't use viral GPL licenses because they require that any code that uses GPL is itself released as GPL. And to that, I ask, like, do we actually want wide adoption if some of that adoption is for unethical uses? You know, I think in my experience studying open source communities, a signal of success is everyone's using my project. And I understand that, right? Like, that's cool. I want everyone to use the things I create, but I've increasingly been thinking about, like, maybe actually we don't want wide adoption. It's not about the scale, it's about the quality. It's what is it being used for? And that's at least to me, a convincing rebuttal to this. So norm setting and community governance. I think this is another really powerful one. Norms are not foolproof, but they are powerful. They set default behavior, they scaffold agreement about what is okay and what isn't, and if thinking, taking the anthropological view, they're a primary way that communities set bounds of ethical behavior. Like, you and I learned what is okay and what isn't, and we generally follow that based on these norms that we absorbed from our community growing up, right? So they sort of set the default behavior, and we can when we're creating tech, we can think about what norms we are setting and how we can enforce sounds strong, or just like encourage those norms in ways that we think are productive. So there are different ways to set norms. One is a public platform. I'm a researcher at a fancy institution at Carnegie Mellon, and we have powerful personal and institutional platforms. We can use this platform to promote certain use cases. Like, a lot of my favorite tweets are like, oh my God, look at what this library has been used to do this really important, for this really important use case. This is helping people. This is, solving a problem that we think is a really important problem to solve. We can also criticize these use cases we believe are harmful. Even if we have less power to stop people from using our tools for harm, we can attempt to show that, to paint something that we believe is harmful as such in sort of the public zeitgeist using our public platform. We ought to use this platform more, I believe. We can also, have acceptable use policies for support forums and ban people who use your tech in ways that might contravene that policy. This is something the deepfake tool community did, and probably stopped some misuse, or at least dissuaded some. Certainly did not stop all. And again, licenses set strong norms. And right now the norm is actually in the opposite direction. Open source sets norms, sets a norm that you ought to disavow use. And we can use other licenses, or rethink how licenses could be used to set other kinds of norms. And I think that is powerful. Okay, I guess they're all great now. Technological restrictions. So we remember this quote earlier on in the presentation. Right now, for people that want to use this software to make porn, they're not very into how it works. They just want the end result. Right now, you have to do quite a lot of manual stuff to set up the whole environment. And they were arguing that, like, the hurdles in the way, like, do dissuade people who might not be technologically skilled, which is not everyone, right, from using it for harmful uses. So there are varying degrees of hardness of technological restrictions. Soft restriction might prevent casual misuse. For example, even if we release something open source, for example, deepfake software that can be used for porn, we might build in a filter that detects and quits on pornographic use. And of course, it's open source. Anyone who knows how could take that out, but everyone's not going to know how to do that, and that may stop some harmful use itself, right? So I think, and this is again a way we can set norms. We can actually like build in the default that has the filter or has the harm reduction technique, even if it is then open sourced and a skilled user could remove it. I think that will set norms and also stop some misuse. There's also been some proposed harder technological restrictions that I have a little less faith in, based on DRM or based on cryptographic keys or blockchains, sort of forcing those restrictions to stay in and not be able to be taken out. I'm not quite sure how that works. I think also there are concerning ethical issues with DRM, as sort of anyone who's followed that sort of software freedom movement might know. Usage monitoring. This is a really interesting case. For code, some have set, as I mentioned, different ways of examining or tracking what people use things for. I'm not sure how that would work well for code, but it might work better for, this might have ethical downsides itself. I mean, it depends on us trusting the monitor. But it might work better for software as a service, which some have argued provides some amount of openness. Like if it's a software as like a hosted service, you might be able to scrutinize it in some ways, but it's not fully open, and then you can monitor it for misuse. So this might be a middle ground approach. This was Kavadi et al. that sort of proposed this, and I really appreciate that paper. This is one that I'm excited about, release gating. So only releasing to certain people, for example, members of the scientific community, those people who you trust, right? Hugging Face recently released the built-in functionality for models and data sets where you fill out a form and you interact with the people who built the thing before you get access to it. And this was explicitly sort of designed to give model creators more control over how their models are used. Might it leak? Might it end up somewhere else on the internet? Yeah, it could. But at least this is another sort of soft restriction or soft as a speed bump in before misuse. And it allows you to set norms again. It allows you to say, you know, this is the process, this is the default way of doing it, and it requires more work or more difficulty to get around those. And finally, I'm going to talk about staged or partial release. Sort of, you might release weights but not code, you might release data but not models. And this can allow some scrutiny, so it allows some of the benefits of openness, people to scrutinize how the system works, come to find, you know, harms such as bias or other kinds of concerns, but it might prevent some misuse too. There's also staged release, release more parts publicly over time, starting with like API hosted access, to then releasing data, to releasing weights, to releasing the whole code base. And this can allow a more like see how things go approach, allow caution, and see how it might be misused as you increasingly release more of it, to see what norms develop and perhaps pull back if it is necessary. And I actually think that studying how this works is itself a really cool research problem or research question. Like from the anthropological view that I tend to take here is like, if we do stage release, what norms do develop versus if we didn't? Or if we stage releases in this way and or partially release things in this way, how can we use that as a tool to affect norms and see how people use it or adopt it and all that? This is a really nice gradient from Suchman, ranging from a fully closed to a fully open approach, and sort of aligning some of the large language models and, you know, other releases along this model, and then sort of some of the considerations they see for each side of the spectrum. And I think this will help scaffold discussion. So what am I talking about Swiss cheese thinking? I have found in my research that oftentimes people like to think in black and white. Like we either try to stop all misuse or it's a fool's errand and we're not going to try it all. And my middle name is Gray. I also think in black and white a lot, but I take my name as a reminder to think in gray, and to think that preventing misuse is a shade of gray. There's not a silver bullet here. None of this is, you know, perfectly satisfying to me. But even if you can't stop all misuse, middle ground approaches are better than nothing. And this is where we get to Swiss cheese thinking. When you think about software security, if you ask any software security expert, every system can be hacked. Every system can be hacked. There's no way to stop all hacks. That will not happen. No one in software security that I've talked to at least believes that. But the point is to add layers of protection that make it harder and harder and harder to hack the thing. And that can stop some hacks, and it might even stop the one that you were worried about, you know, the big one, right? Which is better than stopping none. So sort of layers of protection. And thinking about in public health as well, this is actually what the diagram was about. Masks are not 100% effective. Neither is hand sanitizing, neither is social distancing, neither is even vaccines. Even though they are extremely effective, they are not 100% effective. But they do stop some cases and they stop some people dying, and that is meaningful. So even if we can stop some people using, you know, for example, deep fake tools for harm or large language models for harm, that is meaningful. That will change, you know, some people's lives, and that's important. So I think we ought to think in sort of the Swiss cheese model, where each layer, or at least stage, we try and stop some misuse, and we try and employ a variety of imperfect tactics to stop as many as possible. That's what I have to present to you today. Thank you so much for your attention. On balance, I believe we should default towards openness in AI production, but I don't think that should let us disavow misuse. And I think, therefore, we ought to adopt and explore middle ground approaches, which is itself a hard research problem that I think is really interesting to try and explore further. Here's a summary of what I talked about. Here's the underlying papers I talked about. And like I mentioned, I'm going to be in Cornell Tech, hopefully, assuming I defend successfully, in September. I have a lot of time to collaborate, and I'd love to continue thinking about any of this with any of you. And right now, I would love critique. This is the first time I've talked about a lot of these ideas, and I'd love to hear your feedback. So thank you so much.
David, thank you so much for joining. This is such a timely talk, and we're just delighted to have you. We're going to get started right away with questions, and I see a hand raised, so feel free, Ajit, just jump right in.
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Wonderful presentation. My question is with regards to actually thinking about that Swiss cheese model. Working in healthcare, that's a model we use extensively when thinking about errors and miscalculations, faults. And in the way that we talk or teach about accountability, at least within healthcare, we try to take a global view in which individuals remain acutely aware of their position across that Swiss cheese model, so that they're aware of what could have taken place upstream or what has yet to happen downstream, while also enforcing certain ideas of accountability in the moment. And so I'm wondering, what are ways in which we can learn how other industries have dealt with this Swiss cheese model to think about accountability and think about enforcement in the supply chain for AI?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Ajit. So I think that, I'm actually doing some of this for my final piece of work for my dissertation is, at least like I mentioned, at least in some of my work, I've noticed that some software engineers see it as black and white and see it as like we can either conclusively solve a problem, or we ought to, stop people from misusing it, or that's not for us to think about, that's down there. So I think that, like, in my view, it's about taking a supply chain approach and actually thinking, this is not general purpose technology. This is not pure technology, as science technology scholars would call it. We are going to try and situate what we're building in the context of what we're using and what we're using it for, and what people are using what we built for. So it's about that, like, located accountability approach, and noticing that everyone in this sort of chain, in this wild chain that makes the Amazon Echo dot work, or the sort of more constructed one I presented based on our empirical results, thinking about what your unique opportunities for action or agency might be, where you sit with the people you work with who funds you in academia, for example, or thinking through that, thinking in a very situated way about where you are. I also think, I happen to know Ajit's a doctor, so I think we can learn from other fields where like safety critical systems and software often does take this approach, like, flight software. I worked at NASA for a little bit, and it wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about, like, this thing must not crash. So we're going to have multiple layers of reasons why our precious Mars helicopter baby isn't going to crash, Yeah, great question. Thank you. Jesse, I think you're next on my list, at least.
Yeah, thanks. This is a great talk. I really appreciate hearing all of the things that you're talking about. I feel like we've been talking about a lot of these things individually over the last few years, so it's nice to see them all together. I also am feeling a little pessimistic in general about the direction of the field, and I'm curious to get your take on this, because I was involved in the Big Science project last year, and we tried to do a bunch of things to address a lot of the issues that you've brought up here. I also work on, improving transparency in the research community, and we've been doing all of that stuff. And the field is moving to be less transparent and more closed, and to not, it's like trending away from this. So I love the things that you're talking about, and I think it would be great if this was more broadly adopted, but I just don't see how we can influence that.
Theory of change, yeah. Like, how do we get there?
Yeah.
Yeah, and being very humble, I don't pretend to have all the answers either. But I think that, I'd go back to where we have platforms, where we uniquely might have power. I don't think we can change. And so actually, you're talking about science here, and I think that, like, the arguments I've heard against openness largely either boil down to safety, because they believe in artificial general intelligence, or they boil down most often to economic incentives. So if we're thinking about science, I'm actually a little bit more hopeful, because I think that there is increasing recognition, is that a word? Within the scientific community, that openness is necessary for good science. And I think that, I know it's not all the way there. I also know we have like I was at Microsoft, and there were questions about, like, what we can release publicly and what we can't. But at least with academics I'm working with who are trying to set the rules for a lot of, like, NLP conferences, I think there are increasing pushes towards openness. Now, in the broader community, or sort of, I guess, where economic incentives do reign more heavily, I'm a little bit more, I'm sharing your pessimism. And that's why I'm giving this talk, because I'm trying to influence folks. And I'd welcome your thoughts on like how we can achieve that faster, how we can achieve that with more power.
Yeah, I don't have answers here either. I think there was some discussion, at one point in your talk you mentioned maybe there should be requirements on transparency and openness when you're publishing. A rebuttal to that I've heard is that then people who are creating these large models would just not publish at our conferences, and they would just write a blog post and release their model and get millions of users and not participate in the scientific community anymore, because the scientific community purposefully is excluding that work, but the work is, economically driven, and so will happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think,
I don't know.
I think science, like big S science, is like carries prestige, and I think we can use that. Maybe I'm more optimistic than about how much that'd be effective or not. But I think a lot of people at these companies see themselves as researchers and know that, like, we'll take these norms that are set in a variety of ways seriously if we can, nudge them in that direction. I don't know. I don't know if it will work. But again, I think it comes back to norms. So the more ways we can influence norms, there will always be outliers, but the better off we are. Love any more thoughts, any feedback here. Who's next here?
Abhilasha.
Hey.
Hi. Great talk. I enjoyed your analysis so much. I guess I'm kind of curious because a lot of the discussion in the talk was kind of focused on analyzing the benefits of a project in isolation, maybe. Like when we think about, like, okay, let's analyze the supply chain both up and down. It's still in the context of what I'm building. So I guess I'm curious about how you can analyze these systems in the context of the entire ecosystem surrounding them. For example, say there's like a deepfake product that's not open source, but is really easy to use. And then you release an open source version of that deepfake product. Maybe the increased transparency helps people who are building deepfake detectors do things that they couldn't have otherwise. I guess I'm just, I wanted to get your take on how to analyze even questions of whether we should build this thing or not in this more relative, broader sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's a general answer to that, like everyone's specific case, And I think that's why you're asking the question, right? It's hard. I think that, I guess that I'm in favor of sort of just these questions. I'm in favor of loosening discourses around technological neutrality however way we can, and seeing that like what we choose to build affects what exists in the world, and how we choose to build it, what sort of like affordances we build in or don't affects how it is easier or harder to use. So I would think that like it's a very individual. I mean, I don't have a great answer for you. It's a very individualized question, and I think that with each new piece of technology that AI2 and many other excellent research institutions develop, I think this discussion has to happen again and has to be a serious thing that is discussed for each new development. I'm mainly, I mean, it sounds like we agree, and I'm just asking for kind of like help here, thinking about how to loosen discourses of neutrality, loosen discourses of inevitability, so that we do see the opportunities for agency that might be left. Like we can, for example, have really, I would think for deepfakes it'd be great to have the code be gated. You tell us who you are, and each time you want an update, you have to re-get it again. You have to tell us who you are, what you're using it for, and have some kind of community, have some kind of connection with the person who's releasing it.
Right. I guess I'm just curious about what if not everyone follows these principles, and there are some people who are just like doing whatever, and some people who are being like way more careful about it. Like, I don't know how to think about net good or net harm in these cases.
No, that's a really good point. And that's so like not everyone will follow norms. The point of norms is that you know when they're broken because someone breaks them and they don't follow them. So, but stopping like 10% of people from using it for harm, for example, is still good. It's just still better than not, you know? So, and that's where I think about like how many different roadblocks can we put up towards misuse or to harm so that it is harder to do, recognizing that even vaccinated people who are masked and social distance can sometimes get COVID, you know? So yeah, let's see who's next in line there. And Martin made a really good point in the chat there.
Sam, I think.
Sure, yeah, great talk. Really found it quite inspiring to myself in that I'm a software engineer, so I just work on code that's involved in the system. And as you were kind of talking, something I found interesting is that I use that as a way to kind of exit some responsibility for what I do. And then I say it's just the code. The weights are what's important. The training's what's important. I just write, you know, the Python that wraps the model. Anybody can write that. I'm not thereby not as responsible for, you know, the potential harm that might result. So I just thought that your commentary on that, your illustration of that, and the fact that kind of we all have agency in the chain to think about is really motivating and inspiring. So thank you for provoking that thought. I'm curious on that note of thinking about kind of organizational dynamics, and if you've thought about how do you kind of incorporate in an organization this thought process. And it's kind of a vague question, so let me try to provide some specificity. With respect to like security models, right? A lot of organizations now are starting to incorporate like a CSO. They have a chief security officer. And I think that's because what they found is that it's really hard to get individual groups to do the right thing with respect to security because they're not motivated to. They're just motivated to deliver results, get something out the door faster. So they really need this like neutral, in theory, neutral party that is kind of acting as a check and balance to say, no, thou shalt have a firewall, right? Like you're going to do these things that you need to do. In the same way, do you have thoughts on like the organizational model that helps provoke the types of ethical processes and thought that need to happen that can be seen as some as like a restraint or a restriction of progress and innovation?
Great question, Sam. And thank you for asking. I have probably a whole nother talk's worth about organizational dynamics. I've served at Intel and Microsoft on the responsible AI team. I did research about the organizational dynamics that make it hard to do that, hard to do responsible AI. And I'm actually writing, doing the final part of my thesis about this, the social and organizational dynamics that make it hard. In sum, I think you're right. I think appointing someone who's in charge of making this institutional change will help, ideally someone who already has power and influence in the org. I think that unfortunately the security analogy only goes so far, because it's generally agreed upon that like if someone gets hacked, that's bad. Like there's a lot of normative alignment in security. Like, yeah, it's bad. Like almost every software engineer, even if it's not their job, yeah, we don't want it to be hacked, you know? But not everyone agrees on ethics. Like there's normative misalignment there. What normative being like what is good or should exist in the world. So I think it's a little harder. I think also, and in some of my more recent research, and I'm actually about to check my email after the talk to see if it got into fact, is about I surveyed a bunch of software engineers who self-report ethical concerns. 115 people reported ethical concerns to me anonymously, and I asked them about what made it harder or easier for them to report those concerns or raise those concerns in their organization. And a few things. I mean, one, very basically, if you have financial precarity or if you have visa or immigration precarity, you're less likely, like if your basic needs aren't met, you're going to get kicked out of the country, you're less likely to do it. So there's sort of like economic factors that we can think about as a society that will make us more willing to talk about ethics, I think, and in ways that might rock a boat. But also within the organization, people talked about more open cultures and what I call license to critique. I think a lot of organizations are better at critique, like allowing anyone, even the new intern, to raise their hand and go like, hang on, like, I don't understand this, what are we doing here? And this is often modeled from above. Unfortunately, and this is a finding of the paper, is that like companies make money. You know, that is their job. That is what they have I mean, if they're public, they have a responsibility to their shareholders to do so. So when ethics is seen as opposing that sort of fundamental driving force, that can be difficult. I think we're a lot more privileged in research institutions and in universities to resist that kind of thinking. But that is a very good question, and I have like so much more content I can get into. I'm actually designing a game right now to talk about ethics in a way that hopefully is safer and lets people feel more of a license to critique, feel more of a right to raise their hand, I guess. I realize we're at time. I have at least another hour, and I'd love to take any more questions.
I will ask my question and keep it brief, David. A great talk. I'm going to ask a slightly spicy question that is sort of connected to what Sam was asking, which part of this talk reminded me to the work that Nick Vincent is doing around data poisoning and what is the responsibility of users to get their model back, what kind of things we can do to either, poison the data that this model feed on or the very system. How do you see that line of work align with incentive for big companies to do the right thing? I see like you talked maybe about a lot of carrots. That's more like a stick, but would love to hear your takes on that.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that work, so I'm not sure I'd have a great answer. Are you asking for
in general work that individual users or collective groups can do around poisoning the data is used to train, or all the prompt hacking that folks do, that kind of work?
That's a great question. Actually, sorry, yeah, I'm not familiar with that work, but I'm inspired by the work of Seda Gursis in Delft, who is actually also doing the postdoc, who did the postdoc I'm about to do, and she talks about protective optimization technologies, POTS, and ways that users or people without a lot of institutional power can themselves mess with algorithms in ways, or mess with data in ways that like makes it harder for them to be misused against them. I am less familiar with sort of the variety of technical ways that can happen, but I think that it boils down to a question of power and a question of how we can shift power differentials or more equalized power differentials between users and companies, or different companies, or developers and their managers and stuff like that. I'm sorry I couldn't give a more specific answer. I'd have to think more about that.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Any other questions? Will Smith, go ahead.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. One of the things that your really clear table here has raised for me, a question that's raised for me is one of the difficulties I'm having when I think about the upsides and downsides is that a lot of these are really empirical claims. And we don't know until something happens what will be the case. It's hard to argue about them as a matter of principle. For example, the concentration of power is an upside, but it's just potential. We don't really know until it happens whether that can be validated. And the same thing for the risk argument on the downside. It's sort of AGI, it would be nice to know whether it's beneficial or harmful, but of course, once it exists, it's kind of too late if it actually is harmful for us. So it's hard to know in beforehand how to understand these things. And your middle ground approaches, and please correct me if I'm wrong, are sort of things that researchers or research community can do to achieve these ethical outcomes. I'm wondering whether those are inadequate in the case where we just don't have the empirical knowledge we need to make judgments about what will happen. And we need something stronger. I'm talking about regulatory interventions, like something like before you can release an AI model, something stronger would be you have to go through an application process like we do for patents, or you might have to go through a randomized controlled trial process like we do for FDA drug approval. And those will actually be stronger than norms and stronger than licenses that have limited enforceability. But that would achieve more of the values you're talking about, but won't put the burden on the researchers. And so I'm wondering whether your middle ground is really tenable, or if we have questions about whether it's going to be have efficacy, should we look at a different set of solutions to these problems?
So thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I would agree that a lot of these possible upsides and downsides are predictions, are beliefs that other people have argued for and reasonably argued for, I believe. In many cases, I mean, I've done some research into the history of, like, for example, nuclear proliferation, and facing a very similar issue. We want to publish, you know, knowledge about nuclear science. We also don't want it to be misused in certain ways. And I think that, you know, of course, you make the really good point that I should have put in this talk of, we can learn from that specific case about regulation, about different sort of release and export mechanisms, or different kind of, not patent, but sort of approval processes that you talk about. So I focused here in this talk about opportunities for agency and norm shaping at the sort of organizational or individual level. But I think you're right. We can learn from history, learn and think harder about, like, how this fits into regulatory options, how there might be regulatory options that broaden and expand and increase the power of possible middle ground approaches. It's a very good point. Please, I'll write down your thoughts, and if you want to follow up with that later, I'd love to make this list longer and figure out you know, better ways to argue, or a bit more better support for some of the upsides and downsides.
David, we'll I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll, like, officially wrap up the talk, but leave the room open so people can stay and ask questions and chime in as needed. I'm going to pop up to go deal with a sick child on the couch over there. And yeah, thank you so much, David. It was such a pleasure to have you. I look forward to continuing the conversation offline. And thank you. Good luck with your thesis defending.